Good afternoon, everybody, wherever you may be. My name is David Goodman. I'm the director of the China Studies Centre here at the University of Sydney, in Sydney, Australia. You may be somewhere else. Before we begin, may I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the University of Sydney is based, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay respect to them and their traditions, past, present, and emerging. I'm going to hand over shortly to Professor Louise Edwards from the University of New South Wales, who will be the moderator and chair for today's session. We're looking at this week, next week and the week after, a series of 3 webinars on women in China that have been put together by Dr. Minglu Chen from the University of Sydney. And she's managed to convince 3 excellent speakers, I think one of them is herself, to talk on this topic. And now, without further ado, over to Professor Edwards.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank Minglu and for inviting me to take on this role as chair to this fabulous series of speakers, and also to Yanping Zhang for doing all the back of house organising. It's always a pleasure to participate in the University of Sydney events. I'm coming to you from Footscray, Melbourne, which is the traditional lands of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today we have the first of, as David said, 3 presentations, and please do check out Eventbrite for the subsequent ones. Next week at the same time on the 19th, we have Jing Song, who you can see on the screen there with that beautiful timber background. She's coming to us at the moment from Yunnan, where she's doing field work, and her talk next week will be Women's Entitlement in China's Urbanization. And then on the 26th, so that's another Monday at 5 o'clock, the organiser, Dr. Minglu Chen, will also be speaking, and she'll speak to us about her recent research on representations of female leaders in the People's Daily. So we've got 2 upcoming and 1 today from the wonderful speaker from Nanjing University, Dr. Jiang Xinhui. I'll just give you a brief introduction to Dr. Jiang. So although most of you will have read her profile when you registered for Eventbrite, but I'll give you a quick rundown so that you know the sort of caliber of the work that she's been producing over so many years now. She's an assistant professor at Nanjing University, and her research clearly examines gender and politics, but with a particular focus on local elections and women's representations and political representation in China. She's published extensively in some very prestigious journals. Her works appeared in Government and Opposition, China Quarterly, Regional Studies, Politics and Gender, among a host of others. And if you have a look at her Google Scholar profile, you'll see that these articles in these very strong journals have already received quite a few citations, even when they're very recent articles. This sterling publication record is backed up by, or was preceded by, her success in 2016 as the winner of the Carrie Chapman Catt Prize for Research on Women in Politics. And for those of you who work on women's suffrage and voting rights, you'll know that Carrie Chapman Catt was one of the leading suffrage advocates for women in the United States. She holds a PhD in political science and international relations from the University of Delaware. And before joining Nanjing University, she was a postdoctoral research fellow at Free University, Berlin, Germany. A fabulous place to be doing your postdoc. I'm sure it was an absolute blast working with the Free University colleagues there, Xinhui. Today, she's going to speak on, the title of the talk is When Socialist Legacy Meets International Norms, Gender Quota Adoption and Institutional Change in China. And I think a lot of you who are here will be interested in the question of gender quotas in politics, because it is a really interesting way that social change has been happening over many decades. Quotas for women has traditionally been associated with left-wing and socialist political parties, but it's gradually become mainstreamed into a kind of the liberal democracies as well. But what we see in this study that Xinhui is going to present for us today is that there's been evolution in the impacts of these quota, the way quotas have impacted politics and the way they have been interacted with by power holders in politics. We know, for example, around the world that only 6 countries have 50% of their parliamentarians being women or more, 50% or more. And some of these countries will surprise you. New Zealand, my homeland, is one of them. Another place is Mexico, which has a quota system. Nicaragua has 54% and Rwanda 61%. And United Arab Emirates also has 50%. Many of these countries introduce quotas as a way of increasing women's participation. There's a whole raft of different ways quotas work, reserved seats, legislated candidate quotas, and political party quotas. So all of these things are operating around the world in different ways to enhance women's access to formal political power. We're all here because we're really interested in China. Well, I'm here because I'm really interested in China and I'm really interested in quotas. So let's now turn to Xinhui and listen to her presentation. She will speak to about 20 minutes, 25 minutes to 6, and then we'll open it up for questions from the panel, but also questions from you in the audience. So while she's talking, note down your questions and we'll give you time at the end to quiz. So over to you, Xinhui. Very much looking forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. Before we move on, can you all hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me, Minglu, and also thank you so much for putting up with all of the chaotic the Zoom link issues before the meeting gets started. I'm so happy for that. And then also thanks for the great opportunity for me to share this recent work that I've done with my dear friend and colleague, co-author Zhou Yunyun, who is gonna leave University of Oslo and then join Queen Mary University of London. And then because of that, she's in the middle of packing and moving, and then that's why she can't join us for today. But I'm happy to forward any questions you have about this paper to her, and I will try my best to address all of the questions. Okay, so the idea of writing such a paper, it's actually, I'm not a historian, I'm a political scientist, so it's actually very new for me to do this kind of process tracing stuff. I met this interviewee during my dissertation fieldwork in 2017. And then this interviewee, she worked at the All China Women's Federation, the national level ones. And then she commented that, so the quota in China was actually a 出口转内销 product. So for those who don't understand this term, it means that it's a product that was originally made in China, or more specifically, made under the CCP. But it got exported later and then got sold back to China as if it's an import. So that was really a surprise to me because I'm not a historian at that time. And then I had no idea that the CCP has such a long history of gender quotas. And more specifically, we read about Dr. Edwards' famous work on women's suffrage, but that's the quotas under the Kuomintang during the Republican era. So I didn't expect that, okay, there's the CCP actually also has a legacy for gender quotas. And then that triggered me. So what's this quota about? And then what are they really asking about? So I did some very, very brief historical digging at that time. So I find out that, okay, back in the 1930s, there are 2 quotas imposed at the Chinese Soviet Republic in 1933, as well as another one, the same threshold of 25% in the border regions. So the border regions, including, for example, Yan'an, Shanganning 边区 in northern China, where the Communist Party occupied. And then there's a photo of the women leaders who got elected into the Congress at that time, which include He Zizhen, Mao's wife. Minglu's work would also cover about her later, and also Kang Keqing, Zhuge's wife. So if the question would be, if gender quota was considered as made under the CCP first. So we wonder, what happened next, and when and how was it imported later? So what makes the CCP decided to bring gender quotas back? Because there was a very long period of time after 1949 that there's no quota in China at all, right? So what makes the CCP decided to bring it back? That's the questions that we intend to address in this paper. So now let's take a look first at what quotas really look like in China. Dr. Edwards mentioned that usually there are 3 types of quotas imposed in the legislative department: the reserved seats, the voluntary party quota, as well as the candidate quota. But China is a little bit different. The story is very complex. So first, there is both the quota for the Congress in the legislative department, as we can see in table next to it. But there's also the quota for 党政领导班子. By that, we mean the party secretary and the governor at each level of government. So there is the party secretary as well as the mayor, as well as all of the deputy members. We need to have at least 1 woman within this governing group. And additionally from that, there is also the quota in grassroots level. So within the village committee in the village, as well as the neighborhood committee in urban China, there is also the quota for at least 1 woman. And so that's complex enough, but to make things worse, for each those bodies, we have 3 different policies or more than that to impose different quotas. Some of them are even conflicting with each other. So to give an example, for example, for the provincial level Congress, there are at least 3 documents. So the first is the law on women's rights and interests. That would set up a quota for provincial Congress. And then there is another one called the outline for women's development, which is issued by the state council and then by the provincial level government. And there's another one by the electoral decision issued, before every election. So sometimes if you got lucky, for example, in my hometown, Hunan province, the quota threshold from the 3 provinces, from the 3 documents are consistent. All of them demanded that we need to have like 30% of women in the Congress. But in province such as Shanxi, it got a little bit tricky. You have the 30% quota from the law, and then 25% of quota from the outline of women's development. And then you have no requirement for quota at all from the electoral decision in the most recent election. So here, despite all the complexities, we decided to only look at 2 types of quota in our discussion in this paper. So the one that applies to what we just said, the 党政领导班子 of all subnational government, which means that at least 1 woman quota. And another one is the reserved seats quota adopted at the National People's Congress. The 22% of women should be elected in the 2008 election. So the reasons for our choice are twofold, because first, they apply to the most powerful positions. And therefore, we do believe that they're most important quotas in China. And then they're also one of the earliest institutionalized quotas that the Women's Federation has pushed for. In other words, they are the prototype. By institutionalized, we mean there have been written rules for that. So we know that back during the Cultural Revolution, there are some, we can say, policies or orders to ensure women's participation, but none of them are actually written rules. So they're not institutionalized, and they got abandoned immediately after the revolution. And then the quotas we're talking about today are still effective and being effectively implemented, at least at the most local level. So that's a reason we picked the 2 types of quota. Yeah. So why adopting quota then? Most of the explanation explained by saying that, okay, first we have the concern for international image, right? So if we have, especially for developing countries and then for authoritarian regimes, a quota means that you might get more loans, you might get more investment, and then more loans and more investment would probably translate into stronger domestic support. And then there is also the explanation that says, okay, it's actually a norm diffusion effect, which means that, okay, now we have 3 waves of global quota diffusion, as the previous slide has shown. But then because everybody else is doing that, so I have to follow that. And then it's like a fashion, right? Both of the explanations actually would probably explain China's quota adoption, but they're never enough. So here I draw a very brief figure to show the connections here. Of course, there is the concern for the international image, as well as the effect from the norm diffusion in the 1990s. But the thing is that you cannot just translate those international pressure into a policy change. There needs to be a domestic actor to translate those pressure and then to push them forward. And that those actors are what we call here the All China Women's Federation, and also scholars, including those who work in the universities, as well as those who work in think tanks and research institutions at the Women's Federation. And there is also the local push from the local Women's Federation. So that's the short story here. But let's look at the longer version of our story. How exactly do they do that? No, I apologize for the noise. It rings really bad outside of my window. Yeah. So the trigger for both quotas is the same, actually, the plunge of women's representation due to the personnel reforms in 1980s. If you are a China expert, or if you're a student of Chinese politics, you would remember that in the 1980s, there are at least 2 personnel reforms imposed. First one by Deng Xiaoping. So he advocated for a merit-based, competence-based selection criteria as to overthrow the criteria of the class-based criteria we used during the Cultural Revolution, right? And then there is another one in 1987. So before 1987, we used this selection rule. We call that 等额选拔制, meaning that the upper level government nominate 1 mayor and then put his name to the local People's Congress for votes for approval, right? And there's no other candidates. But in 1987, we decided, okay, we want to introduce competition. So the upper level organization department would actually nominate 2 candidates. So one would actually beat another one. And then because of those 2 reforms, women actually lost a lot of the elections as well as the selections. So for example, to show some of the data, we don't really have a representative data set because it's in the 1980s. We really don't have a very full and representative data set, but there are some signs. So for example, after the Deng Xiaoping's reform, 1/3 of the women leaders at the provincial level actually left. And then that leads to a drop of the NPC Standing Committee women's percent, because most of the Standing Committee members are actually drawing from the provincial level leaders. So that leads to a drop from 21% to 9%. And then after the 1987 reform, this competitive selection was introduced, women fall even further. So for example, in Henan province, in Shenqiu County, there is a record that in 1984, 100%, so every township has a women leader. So we call that 乡乡都有女乡长. Every township has one. But after 1987, so the data was traced to 1988. So only 30% of the townships have 1 woman. Right. So, and in another county, also in Henan province, during the 1987 reform and then the election after that, there are only 8 women candidates to compete for leadership positions, and all of them lost, making this county has no women leader at all in 1988. So that's the data. And after that, the Women's Federation was really, really upset. And then they show their upset in the newspapers. So using all of the media platforms that's affiliated with the Women's Federation, as well as the mainstream ones, such as the People's Daily and China Daily. So if you understand Chinese and you can read off the titles, it's pretty much showing that we are pretty upset. And then the organization department was actually pushed to host a press conference to address, why there are so few women after the reform. What should we do to address that issue? So that's the background of the SAW's movement. So what can the SAWF do, right? Luckily, we've got a new chairperson, Chen Muhua. She was probably the most powerful woman during that time. She just retired from her position as the first deputy women premier in China. And also she was a Politburo member. So she was really, really powerful. And then to do that, she used her personal connection first to approach the organization department, the head of the organization department, Lu Feng, saying, hey, look at the data, it's pretty bad, right? So we need to convene a conference together with the organization department so that we can issue a quota together. Obviously, the organization department can't say no to her. So they convened the first one in Changchun in 1990, and they issued the first at least one woman quota. But this quota at that time only applies to the county and then the township level. And then it was pretty effective. So the next election, we can see, for example, if in Hubei province, before the election, there were only 36 women mayors, county mayors. But after that, the number doubled, or even, it surpassed, it's 89 women mayors. That's more than double, right? And in Beijing, after the quota was implemented, 98% county level units, which means in Beijing it's the street level office, they meet the quota requirements. So that's pretty much very, very effective. And then Chen Muhua was really motivated by this progress and decided to expand the quota. So now we've only got it in county level. We want to expand it. And then the timing was perfect for her, right? Because it's the 1995 World Conference on Women is coming, and then China really, really needs to shine and then to improve its international image at that time. And Chen Muhua was also very powerful. She just wrote a letter directly to the Vice President Hu Jintao at that time, who later became China's president in early 2000. And then showed him in the letter. So we find this letter actually in a memoir of Chen Muhua, saying that, look, we've only got 7% of women in provincial level cadres, as well as in the prefectural levels. We need to make China look good, right? The World Conference on Women's coming. So Hu Jintao agreed to her proposal and decided to have the second meeting. And this meeting eventually decided that, okay, all of the subnational level government, not including the national one, just subnational one, should have at least one woman quota. And then during, before the conference, the State Council started issuing this outline for women's development. And then basically it's copying, it's using the same framework as the platform for action issued in Beijing. So having all of the quantifiable targets of women's development, including women's quota in decision-making bodies. And then from then on, all of the quotas was issued from this outline of women's development. And because it renews by itself every 5 or every 10 years, which means that it no longer requires additional lobbying or pushing from the All Women's Federation. And that's when we decided, okay, it's actually a success for the Women's Federation. And Chen Muhua also played a very important role when trying to promote this quota to the subnational level government. So we find a lot of she's trying to hold the government accountable by referring to the international pressure. So we had this quote during her talk in Shandong province. She just mentioned that, okay, this is urgent. There is a 30% quota from this conference, and we made a commitment, right? we have to hold on to it. If we don't honor it, people think our government is not reliable. So there's clearly the pressure from the international society, and Chen Muhua is very smartly using it to push for the implementation. So as we can tell, to sum this this story up, although we see that international pressure, the whole process is highly state-centered or even party-centered, because the appointment of cadres is within the party's jurisdiction. There's no involvement of any other actors, and it's highly individual-based. We are basically relying on Chen Muhua and her personal connections to push things forward. As we now turn to the second quota story, we can see that the strategies are different, and then the actors also are different. So the story has the same beginning with women's representation at the Congress dropped in 1980s. But it seems that it's more difficult to insert a quota into the Congress because the legislative department, regardless of how the members are elected, right? Whether it's indirectly or directly, there is uncertainty associated with the results. So it's very different from the top-down appointment of a county mayor. You cannot just go out and issue an executive order saying that, hey, we want to have 5% of women, right? That's not going to happen. So you have to change the electoral law. So it's more challenging. But the ACWF took an opportunity during the legislation of the first law on protection of women's rights and interests, which was issued in 1992. So in 1990, the ACWF started pushing and then trying to insert a quota for that. And then the newspaper started reporting about it. But unfortunately, the proposal was blocked. And then the reason was really, really clear. It was published in the Chinese women's newspaper. It was saying that we don't have enough competent women. And if we insert a quota into a law, if we cannot meet the quota, that means, okay, are we breaking the law or something? So it will be a challenge to the election result. And then they don't think that's feasible. So that was blocked in the first proposal. But interestingly, when provinces started implementing this law, because they have the jurisdiction, have some discretion to revise the law according to their own needs. Some of the provinces decided, okay, we want to have our own quota for our own provincial level Congress. So for example, Hunan province started to issue a 30% candidate quota into their own implementation of the women's law. And the Hebei province issued another one, the 25% one. So that's what the provinces started doing. However, when the provincial, but then learning from its first lesson, its failed lesson from the first failed lobbying efforts. So the Women's Federation decided, okay, we need to build up our case. We need to show that a quota is feasible in China. And to do that, they decided to build up coalitions with the academia. And the academia was really, really strong at that time for gender studies because of the World Conference on Women. So that's when a lot of universities started to fund those gender studies center. And in 1999, the ACWF founded this Women Research Society, and each province has its own Women Research Society. When I first returned to China, I got contacted immediately by this society and joined the society. So it's basically a research networks that connected all of the women's studies scholars. And then from them, the ACWF funded several projects on women's representation in politics. So this research outputs show that there is a gender quota diffusion wave outside of China, and then a lot of developing countries started issuing gender quotas. And then using their research outputs, Peng Peiyun, the chairperson of Women's Federation after Chen Muhua, decided, okay, I need to take a visit to the Nordic countries. the Nordic countries are basically the pioneers of gender quotas at that time, right? So Pompeo Yun went to Nordic countries, and accompanying her were a few or several women leaders from the provincial level, and they learned about the gender quotas. And right after she returned from the Nordic countries, she decided to host the first workshops on women's representation, and then convened a lot of scholars from Shanghai, Beijing, and Shandong to discuss how can we make a legislative proposal to insert a gender quota into the election law. And together, out of these projects, they drafted two proposals. One, it tries to insert a 25% gender quota, and another one tried a 1/3 gender quota. And they submitted that in 2001, and another one in 2003. But unfortunately, all of the proposals were blocked at that time. And unfortunately, I couldn't find any information regarding why would the Congress decided to block it. Even though Pompeo Yun, in her proposal, she wrote that it's a socialist tradition, and we had this 25% quota from 1930s. So, but I'm not sure how that got blocked. So maybe any historians can help me out here. So that's the story of how it was blocked. And then the turning point came actually after Pompeo Yun left the All Women's the CWF in 2003. So the women's representation in the NPC dropped to a new low, 20%. That's actually the lowest point after the Cultural Revolution. And then the National People's Congress was basically, felt very disappointed about this result and decided, okay, maybe we should have a quota for women's representation. So they met actually in the middle point. They did not adopt the 25% gender quota, but used a 22% one. And then the negotiation of the number is still unclear. There's no data or no information for that. All we know is that they did not use the socialist one, but to use a lower benchmark. My guess is that because women's representation, the percent is fluctuating around 21 to 22% after the Cultural Revolution. So they want to actually codify this benchmark instead of setting a higher target that we might fail to meet. So that's my guess, but I'm not sure if that's true. And that's the end of this story. We adopted a 22% gender quota in 2007, but it's also a one-time thing. So after the 2008 election, there's no more new quota coming out of it. It was only saying that the future elections cannot have fewer women than the previous one. So the 22% is actually the only number the NBC has ever agreed to. Okay, so and then I also want to show you guys, of the provincial level quotas, because the provincial levels are actually going further. As we can see, Henan province has this 33% gender quotas. And then there are over, I think 7 of them have this 30% gender quotas as well. So it's pretty much that the local Congress, gives this confidence to the national level Congress that, okay, those quotas are actually feasible in China, and we can do that. And then because all of the provincial level Congress quota is actually adopted before the national one, so there is actually a local push from the local government. Okay, so we can make a very brief conclusion and then discussion. We can see that there is a lot of similarities between the two quota adoptions. The first one being that the ACWF played the most important role, right? You cannot challenge for that. And also quotas are pushed incrementally. We never achieved what we want at the beginning. It's always, we want a 1 women quota, but first we want to have it at the county level. And then for the National Congress, we started from things like very vague wording. We want to have appropriate number of women in the Congress. And incrementally, gradually, we achieved this bigger role, bigger target. But there are also great differences between the two quota adoption stories. as we can tell, the second story, the second quota for the Congress involves clearly more actors, right? We have academias, and we also have the local push, and we also, we took a visit to the Nordic countries. So the international pressure probably played a bigger role in this adoption. And the strategy is also very different. The first one is very, very, very individual based, and it's very much relying on Chen Muhua. But the second one is coalition based. It's a coalition based gender lobbying. That's what we call it. It involves not just the ACWF, but also different actors. And also it becomes more institutionalized. We no longer write a letter to the president, right? We use legislative proposals through the legislative department. Of course, there are also reasons for that, because it's a different generation. Policymaking in China is more institutionalized in 2000s. And also, it's a different target. It's not, as we have discussed, we have to challenge the law. To change the law requires a proposal, a bill draft to the Congress. So that's the differences. And then, so to wrap it up, that's the quota story of China. And of course, there's much more to say about its implementation and the status quo of women's representation in today's China, but that's a different paper. And I'm happy to discuss more about it during the Q&A. Yeah, so that's my talk, and then let's give it back to Dr. Edwards. Thank you so much.